All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Jeff Everhart. I'm a developer advocate with Knock, and I'm joined today by Connor Lindsay, who is a product engineer at Knock. And we're going to talk you through how we approached a new feature that we just launched. So, Connor, this feature is called partials, right? And I figured maybe we could get started by explaining sort of the background problem that we were trying to solve with this feature and like how did we know it was a problem and ultimately sort of how did you approach this as an engineer to solve that for our customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So partials is a way that you can create reusable snippets that you can reuse throughout your various message templates. And this is really helpful as the number of templates that you have grows so that you can have these reusable building blocks or components in the same way that you would, if you're building a React application or a Svelte application. And so we felt like, it was a very natural tool to be able to give our users so that they could create those reusable components and have them consistent throughout all of their different templates.
Yep, the template management aspect of Knock is definitely one of its selling points. And so that allows you to manage all of these different message templates across all of your notification channels. And so what you're saying is partials will sort of work across any of those channels and make some of those components reusable, say like an in-app and an email?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a couple different types of partials that you can create depending on what content is within them. And then, there's overlap between the different channel types that you have and that content. Plain text, use that wherever, or HTML, you'll have it in an email template, for example. And one of the most powerful things about partials is that you're able to pass in variables to them, which makes them reusable. Okay. And it was one of the kind of key points about using them in various situations.
Ooh, interesting. The passing in of variables, I think is definitely, when we get to the demo, maybe that's something we should spend a little bit of time looking at.
For sure.
But we've got a couple of background questions here that I just wanted to ask before we jump into the demo. So just at a really high level, could you explain to our listeners or our viewers like how Knock processes templates? Just how that whole system works?
So we think about templates in kind of two stages. The first is when you're actually authoring a template. You're creating it in the dashboard, or maybe you're managing them via the management API or CLI, which we provide. And that's where you're writing your template, you're writing the notification that you're going to be sending out, and then the other side of that is when we're actually rendering and sending those notifications out. So you write one generic template, and then you can include things like data about each recipient to customize that notification as it gets sent out. So those happen in two different steps and two different services within our architecture. And so each of those have kind of different technical considerations. You're writing the template one time, but depending on the scale of how many notifications you're sending, you're going to be rendering that notification orders of magnitude more times. And so one interesting thing that we do at Knock for processing our templates is wherever possible, if we can pre-process some information, maybe preload it during that authoring step where we author the template and then send it over to our rendering service, we want to do that. It'll just make it a lot faster for rendering. And so that comes into play with things like, preloading the HTML layout for an email template that you have selected, or doing things like loading default CSS, or like the Knock branding for free accounts, as well as some other processing that we do around translations. And now partials is kind of a step of that processing pipeline so that we can do as much of the work as possible during that resolution step before actually rendering them. So they do it one time instead of, thousands or tens of thousands, depending on how many notifications you're sending.
Gotcha. And so in terms of your work on this particular feature for partials, right, that essentially touched on sort of both of those parts of the template rendering process at Knock, right? The authoring aspect and the actual rendering pipeline?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the interesting bits of working with partials was figuring out how we wanted to work with the liquid specification and how you would normally handle partials or the render tag in liquid, and how we wanted to handle it in our system, because we do have those kind of two stages. And so Yeah, we went with kind of a custom route where we do some pre-resolution of the partials. We preload the content, kind of massage the format of the liquid that then gets sent to our rendering service. And so yeah, that was definitely an interesting to figure out how we wanted to handle it and get that all working correctly with some, custom liquid tags.
And so I have kind of a follow-up question that builds on that a little bit. I heard you mention, using the render tag in Liquid. And so there's sort of a specification to do this inside of Liquid already, right? Were there other products or solutions out there that you looked at as you were sort of developing your own approach to how we would implement partials in Knock?
Yeah, the biggest thing, not necessarily products, but was other open source libraries.
Okay, cool.
That's
sometimes even cooler.
Yeah, we use, JavaScript, React on the front end, and we use Elixir on the back end. Mm-hmm. And throughout the different touch points we have for partials, we need to interact with those Liquid libraries and kind of extend or override how they would handle render tags or partials. And so I think that was the big source of learning, how to work with the Liquid spec, what are kind of the standard ways that you would handle partials and attributes, and how could we tweak that for our scenario. For example, in our Elixir backend, kind of the default behavior for a render tag is that you're going to have a file system where you're loading partials from. Maybe if you're familiar with the Shopify template editor, we're going to be loading section.liquid, and you're going to put that, or footer.liquid, and you're going to include that in all of your pages on a Shopify site, for example. We would kind of override that behavior where instead of loading from the file system, we already preloaded that content. And so, yeah, just a lot of working with the different Liquid.js on the front end, and then we're using a library called Solid for Elixir to handle Liquid on the back end.
Okay, all that sounds awesome. So maybe from here, if we could, Connor, could you share your screen and just give us sort of like a 1-2 minute walkthrough of what this feature looks like for the users?
Yeah, there are kind of two main parts to working with partials. The first is authoring them, and then the second is actually using them in templates. So we have this located under the developer section of the sidebar, and we have a new partials page. This is where you can manage partials like many other resources in Knock. So partial has a name and description to help identify it, as well as a unique key. And then a partial has a type, which kind of dictates what type of content is it going to contain and the type of templates that it will be relevant for. One interesting aspect is that you can enable HTML partials to be used as a block in the visual editor, which we'll show in a minute. If you do that, you can select an icon to be associated with the partial to make it a little bit easier to identify in the sidebar. So I have a little example of a call to action partial, which just includes a heading and a link. So you could, see using this in a bunch of different email templates, for example. And once you've created the partial with kind of the main information, the most important thing then is actually editing the content. So we have kind of a little preview with some random values. Maybe we'll say that this is going to be used in a onboarding email. So we could say welcome here, and then for the link label, we could say start onboarding. And then we could include, a link here. And this will live update here in this kind of side-by-side preview editor that we had. We wanted to work hard to make this as nice of an authoring experience as possible. And a couple things to point out about kind of the structure of a partial and what you can do with the content. One, you can include inline styles using a style tag, and those will be local to the partial that we have here. In addition to that, you can also include liquid variables. These are going to be extracted out of the partial, and then when you're using them in your templates, you'll be able to pass in values which will be uniquely applied to the given instance of a partial. And this is what really makes partials valuable and reusable. And so you can do things like include that and then pass in, plain text values or liquid variables or even expressions, to format a variable that is being passed in. One other part of the HTML partials is that you're able to preview them within a given email layout. This is really helpful. Maybe you have some default styles in your layout that you want to include, and you want to see what that partial will look like when it's rendered within a given layout. Or optionally, you can preview it without any layout. So I'll save these changes here. And then we can take a look at the second part of working with partials, which is actually using them within a template. So I have this, welcome workflow, which has an email step and an in-app step. And I'll show the two different ways that we can use a partial. The first, in an email, I'll show using it within the visual editor. So got the template loaded here, and you can see we have our system blocks, which are included out of the box with Knock. Things like our button groups, plain markdown or HTML or divider, as well as custom blocks. These are your partials that you have enabled to be used within the visual editor. And you can see, the name and the icon that were selected previously. And this works the same as the other blocks. You can click to add it or drag and drop to view it, drag to reorder, etc. So here I have a simple example with these preview values, and these are kind of plain text values. But in addition to using plain text, you can also pass in liquid. So if I open with these double curly braces, we can see the type ahead pop up, and we can use some of these preview values from the variable data to work with. So if I pass in variable key, for example, we can see that loads into the preview. But we can do other things like format it, for example, make it uppercase. And so this is how we're able to use partials within a visual editor. I'll pop back out to the in-app feed, and then we can show how we can use partials within a code editor. So if I edit the template, we have our example here of using the render tag. And so typical liquid syntax, we open with the curly braces and the percent sign, and then here we have type ahead as well, which will show the partials that are available to be used. So we have our call to action partial, which is the key that we set earlier, as well as a little info component showing some information about that partial, like what attributes does it take, what were the preview variables values for that attribute, as well as the type of the partial. So I can enter it, this will pop up, and then I can type in, welcome, and then we can get our preview going. One other aspect of this that I need to take care of is actually committing the partial so that it's available in the environment that we are working in. So if I go back here, make sure that is set correctly, I can commit this, and then we'll be able to head back over to our template here. And if I reload the page, we should see that appearing. Just make sure that this is rendering correctly. Okay, awesome. So we got that appearing here. This is what it would look like if we're using this in our preview. In addition to using plain text values, we can also use variables here like we would in the visual editor. So we also have the type ahead and some kind of flexibility there for using variables and formatting and such. So yeah, this is a view of partials, how we're able to author them in the developer section of Knock, and then how we're able to reuse them within our templates, either using the visual editor or the code editor, depending on what message template that you're using.
Awesome. That sounds amazing. Those look and feel a lot like components to me. Coming from the JavaScript world, where we provide it these sort of parameters, these arguments, and it renders a particular way. And when you update that source file, it's going to update all of the implementations of that. And so I do have one question. Like I saw in that example, you provided some static values for like the header text and the button text. Are you able to use liquid tags in those inputs as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're using the visual editor, you can start your input with curly braces, and that'll help us know that you're passing in a variable or a liquid expression. So you could, use a variable and then pass in a tag or a filter
to format the date or something, however we wanted to do that. Okay.
And you can do the same thing in the code editor. And so you can, use the render tag, and then you can pass in a comma separated list of keys and values, which will match the, kind of extracted variables from the partial.
And so including that style tag sort of directly in the partial, that's sort of recommended practice, right? I guess.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting, technical points that we were thinking through of how do you include styles? What is a nice way to author them, as well as how do we want to handle that when we're processing partials? And kind of a wrench in that is what works in HTML in like a website may not always work in HTML in an email.
That is so true.
Yeah, and so we're actually really fortunate that using inline styles works perfectly well, and it works with the rest of the HTML and CSS processing that we do. Like we do some CSS inlining to help improve performance and kind of readability of HTML emails. And so that was a really nice win when we got to that part of like researching and figuring out how we're going to handle. It's nice when that happens, right? Oh, it just works. That was great.
It just works. That's great. And it feels, in terms of the authoring experience too, it actually feels really nice. So like, if you're coming from React, I don't think you can just include sort of style tags like that. But when you look at some of these other frameworks like Vue, like if you're looking at Astro in particular, some of these other frameworks will let you sort of have that single file component feel where all of your, styling, your logic, and your HTML is all in one file. So it feels very much like that. And I personally just appreciate that. So that's really cool. So let's transition a little bit. I have just a couple more questions to dig in. And so like, was there anything about, we talked a little bit about Knock's template rendering process, what that looks like. Was there anything in the rest of the system that we had to change to accommodate partials? Like, do we have to change how templates are processed or rendered to make this partials work happen?
Yeah, we luckily didn't have to do, any major refactoring. It was fairly additive in that we're able to, slot in at the right part of our template processing and say, hey, now that we have the template in the state that we want it, we would render it, we would parse it using our liquid parser. That gives us an AST. We can walk through that, identify any render tags, and process them as we needed to. So yeah, that worked out really well, that we're able to just slot in right there, kind of purely additive changes.
Yeah, I feel like this is, we got a humble brag here for a second, because like this was probably one of those features that sort of had always been on the roadmap. Like when you think about creating like, reusable partials, if you've got a templating system, like generally when we approach certain features here at Knock, I feel like that's the response. Like, well, we built this and we sort of always plan to add this thing, and like, here's this nice spot to slot it in. So I don't know if that was the case or not, but I do feel like that happens here, where we have this sort of nice place to hook into the system and add this feature that we want to without having to reorganize a bunch of the other stuff. So that's really cool. We already talked about what we looked at for inspiration. So here, maybe just some personal questions for you as sort of the developer of this. Like, what was the most challenging part of this project for you to implement?
Yeah, one thing that had a lot of fun digging into and learning more about was Liquid and how to handle partials through the various kind of touch points that we have for it. So going back to kind of the split of authoring a template versus actually rendering it, one of the impacts that has on partials is that when you're authoring a partial, you don't actually have the final data that it's going to be rendered with. And so there were definitely a lot of workarounds and figuring out how we wanted to handle certain things about how Liquid handles like scoping and building the context for rendering a template in those separate parts of the system. Or like going back, we were talking about, can you include a variable in the visual editor, those attributes. That was kind of an interesting workaround as well to figure out how to get that working properly with filters. It kind of comes down to, what is the syntax of Liquid and what can you pass in where? And we found some interesting solutions along the way. Like in that case, we can use a temporary variable. So whenever you use a Liquid expression in the visual editor, we use the assign tag to create a new variable
Okay.
and then instead pass that in. And that was required so that, filters or formatting for dates and that sort of thing, that can get processed and then passed in to the partial. One of the other aspects of that was kind of figuring out how do we want to handle scoping, how do variables get passed into partials, and how do we avoid kind of namespace collision and kind of unexpected rendering results.
That all sounds super interesting. Like I smell a blog post, Connor. I think we need a blog post on that, just because. Yeah, that whole interaction to me seems like it would help a lot of people if we documented that. Like with examples. Like that's super cool.
Definitely.
Cool. So, anything else you want to tell us? What are you most excited about getting this feature out there for people to use?
Yeah, definitely. I think the key thesis of the feature, is making components reusable and making your templates a lot easier to manage. And I, experienced the exact same thing working in, UIs and working with a design system, for example, and love to have kind of that source of truth of, what are these components? What do we have to work with? And I think just those benefits are really, really nice to work with. And so excited to see, especially Knock users that have tons and tons of templates. I think this will make it a lot easier for them to manage them, keep them consistent, keep them in line with their design system, as well as being able to use tools like the management API and CLI to even like version control your partials so that don't even have to, live in Knock per se. They can live alongside your other UI code, and that makes that management side of things even easier as well.
Yep, and that's something we really haven't touched on during this talk, but I think it's worth mentioning. Was there anything particularly challenging about, opening up those avenues to manage partials, like through the CLI or through the management API?
Yeah,
Any
this is
additional
another
work you had
case
to
of
do
like
there?
things just work. Not being a developer first tool, our backend is architected in a way that it is very, very easy to have a resource like a partial or workflow or a layout and include them in the management API and CLI. That's really a primary concern of ours, is to make that really easy and to make those tools powerful rather than being an afterthought. Right away, that was one of the first things that was added when working on this feature, from day one, thinking about kind of that API and how we want to handle those things. And again, the architecture is built in a way that we're able to do that very easily, as well as have some kind of powerful abstractions to, for example, with those different layers of like our backend, the management API and the CLI, do things like renaming properties for things that might make more sense internally versus externally, or doing any processing of the information, what fields are required internally or coming from the dashboard versus what makes more sense via kind of these external APIs. And so, kudos to the team that has built all of that out. It was really great to add another resource that comes with all of those kind of developer first
it just works
right away.
The sweetest words in the English language to a developer. It just works.
For sure.
Which is awesome. And it's also great to have that flexibility, especially with something like this. And so for our listeners or viewers who might not know, right, Knock has our primary API where you can sort of operate on, users, these different entities, but then we also have a management API and a CLI where you can work with your workflows and layouts and partials now and templates in code. So to me, it just makes sense, right, that there might be customers out there who, like when you talk about a design system, right, you might not want to do that all in a UI, and you might want to store some of that in source control, have it live in code, and use the CLI or the management API to populate some of that stuff. So that's really cool that we've got that flexibility just right out of the gate. That's awesome. And so I don't know, Connor, you got any other thoughts, anything else you want our audience to know about partials or the work you've done to deliver this feature?
Not at the moment, no. I think we've covered a lot of the technical aspects and kind of the the product decisions we made along the way. Excited to get it out there and see, how we can make it better going forward.
Yeah, awesome. Me too. So thanks again, Connor, for joining me for this sort of inaugural, like, how was it made talk at Knock. For those of you watching at home or listening, thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate your viewership. Definitely go and check out this feature. And if you have any feedback for us on partials or really anything else that you'd like to see built in the product, let us know on the website, join our Slack community, and drop us a line. Other than that, thanks for watching, and knock on.